The year is 1860. The American continent is a vast, sprawling landscape of contradictions, a tapestry woven from threads of industry and agriculture, of liberty and bondage. To the north, a society driven by factories, bustling ports, and the relentless march of progress where the air hangs thick with the smoke of burning coal and the promise of a modern age. To the south, a quieter, more pastoral existence, defined by vast plantations, white-pillared mansions, and endless fields of cotton, an empire built on the labor of enslaved human beings. Between these two worlds lies a fracture, a deep and jagged line that has been widening for decades, a chasm filled with the echoes of legislative compromises and the whispers of an impending storm. It is a time of uneasy peace, a silence that feels less like tranquility and more like the holding of breath before a scream. The nation, once conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, finds itself wrestling with the paradox of its own existence. The question of slavery, that peculiar institution, has evolved from a political disagreement into a moral crusade, an irreconcilable difference that threatens to sever the bonds of the Union. For years the can had been kicked down the road, the fires of conflict dampened by the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, legislative bandages applied to a wound that required surgery. But the temperature was rising. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin had brought the horrors of the slave trade into the living rooms of the North, galvanizing public opinion and stirring the conscience of a nation. In the South, the fear of abolition was not merely political, it was existential. The Southern economy, a delicate ecosystem dependent on the free labor provided by 4 million enslaved people, seemed under siege by the growing abolitionist movement in the North. The raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown, a fervent abolitionist seeking to incite a slave revolt, had sent shockwaves through the South, confirming their darkest fears that the North was not content to let them be, but sought to destroy their way of life by force. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped the figure of Abraham Lincoln. In the election of 1860, the political landscape shattered. The Democratic Party, the last remaining national institution bridging the North and South, split along sectional lines. Lincoln, the candidate of the newly formed Republican Party, a party founded on the principle of halting the expansion of slavery, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. His victory was the signal the Deep South had been waiting for. To them, it was proof that they no longer had a voice in the government they had helped create. The reaction was swift and decisive. Beginning with South Carolina in December of 1860, state by state, the Southern states began to sever their ties with the Union. They declared themselves a new nation, the Confederate States of America, a republic founded, in their own words, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and that slavery is his natural condition. It was an act of rebellion, a throwing down of the gauntlet that the federal government could not ignore. The lines were drawn, the die was cast, and the long, dark night of the American Civil War was about to begin. The atmosphere in the early months of 1861 was one of surreal anticipation. In the North, there was a strange sense of celebration, a naive belief that the rebellion could be crushed with a single, decisive blow. Young men rushed to enlist, fearing the war would end before they had a chance to see glory. In the South, there was a similar fervor, a confident assurance that one Southern gentleman was worth 10 Northern shopkeepers. It was a war, many believed, that would be settled by a picnic, a skirmish on a Sunday afternoon. The first spark ignited in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina there. Sitting like a thorn in the side of the Confederacy was Fort Sumter. Garrisoned by a small force of Union troops under Major Robert Anderson, the fort was running low on supplies. Lincoln, walking a tightrope between war and peace, announced he would send provisions, food, not weapons, to the fort. For the Confederacy, this was an act of aggression, a challenge they had to meet. On the 12th of April, the stillness of the morning was broken. Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The barrage lasted for 34 hours, a thunderous cannonade that lit up the night sky and rained shells upon the fortress. It was, strangely, a bloodless beginning. The Union surrender came without loss of life, save for a horse. But the symbolism was absolute. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. The illusion of peace was shattered. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The border states, wavering between North and South, were forced to choose. Virginia, the mother of presidents, voted to secede, taking with it the strategic imperative of the Confederate capital, Richmond, just 100 miles from Washington. The nation plunged into the darkness of war with a collective breath held tight. The first major engagement, intended to be the single decisive battle that would end the conflict, took place in July on a hot, dusty Sunday near a stream called Bull Run. Spectators from Washington, politicians, and socialites packed picnic lunches and rode out in carriages to watch the show, expecting a quick Union victory. They saw instead the horrifying reality of 19th century warfare. The battle was a chaotic, confused affair. Uniforms were not yet standardized, and in the smoke and din, men fired on their own comrades. The fighting raged back and forth, a seesaw of momentum. But in the end, it was the Confederates, led by Thomas Jonathan Jackson, a professor from Virginia Military Institute who stood like a stone wall against the Union assault, who held the line. The Union Army broke, not in an orderly retreat, but in a panicked rout. The soldiers fled back to Washington, pursued by the jubilant but equally exhausted Confederates. The picnic was over. The war, everyone now realized, would be long, bloody, and terrible. As the reality of the conflict set in, the year 1862 dawned with a grim determination. The romantic notions of glory faded, replaced by the mud of the camps and the smell of disease. The war expanded, moving from the foothills of Virginia to the western rivers, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, the Cumberland. In the West, the Union found a general who understood the nature of the conflict. Ulysses S. Grant, a quiet, unassuming man who had known failure in civilian life. Grant possessed a clarity of vision that eluded his Eastern counterparts. He understood that the war could only be won by relentlessly engaging the enemy. In the damp forests of Tennessee along the Tennessee River, Grant's army encamped near a meeting house called Shiloh. It was April, the air thick with the scent of blooming dogwoods and the damp earth. The Confederate Army under Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack at dawn. What followed was a day of unspeakable carnage. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a brutal slugging match in the woods. Horns blared, drums rolled, and the air was filled with the cries of the wounded. By the end of the first day, the Union lines had been pushed back to the river, but they had not broken. During the night, Grant, battered but unbowed, received reinforcements. The next morning, he counterattacked, driving the Confederates from the field. Shiloh was a Union victory, but the cost was staggering. 20,000 men lay dead or wounded, more American casualties than in all of the previous wars combined. The nation woke up to the true price of its preservation. While the war raged in the West, the eyes of the world remained fixed on Virginia. Here, the Union Army of the Potomac, a massive, well-drilled force, faced off against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by the brilliant and enigmatic Robert E. Lee. Lee, a West Point graduate who had opposed secession, had cast his lot with his home state of Virginia. He was a commander of immense talent, audacious and unpredictable. Facing him was George B. McClellan, the young, dashing commander of the Union forces. McClellan was a superb organizer, a man who loved his army and was loved by it in return. But he was paralyzed by caution, perpetually believing himself outnumbered when in fact he usually held the advantage. The Peninsula Campaign of 1862 was McClellan's grand attempt to end the war. He moved his massive army by sea to the Virginia Peninsula, intending to march up and capture Richmond. The campaign became a slow-motion tragedy. Lee, outnumbered, defended Richmond with a ferocity and cunning that unnerved McClellan. In a series of battles known as the 7 Days' Battles, Lee attacked again and again, driving McClellan back. The fighting was savage, the casualty lists growing longer with each engagement. The Union Army, though often tactically successful, was strategically defeated, forced to retreat. The chance to capture Richmond and end the war in 1862 was lost. The war entered a new, darker phase. The bloodshed of the summer had hardened hearts. The initial war aim of merely preserving the Union began to shift. The institution of slavery, the root cause of the conflict, could no longer be ignored as a military factor. The Confederacy was using enslaved labor to build fortifications and grow food, essentially powering their war machine. Furthermore, the thousands of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines were a strategic asset the North could not ignore. On September 22nd, following the narrow Union victory at Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a document of profound contradiction. As a wartime measure, it declared that all enslaved people in the rebelling states were free. It did not free a single person in the border states that remained loyal, nor in areas already under Union control. Yet it fundamentally transformed the nature of the war. No longer was this a struggle merely to restore the old Union. It was now a crusade for human freedom. The moral weight of the conflict shifted, making it impossible for European powers like Britain and France to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. The year 1863 opened with a nation transformed. The Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect, and with it, the Union Army began to enlist black soldiers. These men, fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of their families, brought a fervor to the fight that was unmatched. The sight of black men in Union blue was a stunning indictment of the Southern cause, a living symbol of the new birth of freedom Lincoln had spoken of. But the war was far from over. In the West, Grant continued his relentless pressure. His target was Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress city perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the river. Capturing it would cut the Confederacy in two, severing the link between the eastern states and the trans-Mississippi West. The campaign to take Vicksburg was a masterpiece of military engineering and sheer will. Grant tried to bypass the city by digging canals, by marching through the swamps, but failed. Finally, in a bold move, he marched his army down the west bank of the river, crossed below Vicksburg, and attacked the city from the east. After a series of battles, Grant laid siege to the city. For 47 days, the citizens of Vicksburg lived in caves to escape the constant Union bombardment. They ate mules, rats, and anything else they could find. On the 4th of July, 1863, the day after the battle at Gettysburg ended, Vicksburg surrendered. The Mississippi River was now, in Lincoln's words, unvexed to the sea. The Confederacy was cut in two, the Anaconda Plan beginning to squeeze the life out of the rebellion. Yet in the East, the story was one of tragedy and near disaster. Robert E. Lee, flush with his victories in Virginia, decided to take the war to the North. He hoped a victory on Northern soil would demoralize the Union public, encourage the peace movement in the North, and perhaps force Lincoln to negotiate. In June of 1863, Lee's army crossed the Potomac River and entered Pennsylvania. The Army of Northern Virginia, confident and seemingly invincible, marched through the rich farmlands of the North, living off the land and spreading fear. The Union Army of the Potomac, now under George Meade, a steady but unassuming general, shadowed Lee's movements. The two armies, nearly 200,000 strong, converged by chance on the small crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On the 1st of July, a detachment of Union cavalry encountered Confederate infantry looking for shoes. A skirmish began that quickly escalated into a full-blown battle. The Union troops were pushed back through the town, but they took up strong defensive positions on the high ground south of the town, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and two round hills, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. The second day of July saw the fighting intensify. Lee ordered attacks on both flanks of the Union Army. The fighting was desperate and close-quartered, in the wheat field, in the peach orchard, and in the Devil's Den. The ground was littered with the dead and dying. On the far left flank, at Little Round Top, the Union line held by a thread. The 20th Maine, commanded by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a college professor turned soldier, ran out of ammunition. Rather than retreat, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge, sweeping the attacking Confederates down the hill and saving the Union flank. It was the kind of desperate heroism that the war seemed to spawn on a daily basis. The third day of July brought the climax of the battle. Lee, believing his army invincible, ordered a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. It was a decision born of hubris and desperation. 12,000 men, the flower of the Confederate Army, formed in the woods on Seminary Ridge. They marched across a mile of open ground under the fire of Union artillery and rifles. It was Pickett's charge. The Union troops held their fire until the Confederates were close. Then the air was filled with a sheet of flame and lead. The Confederate line disintegrated. The few who reached the Union line were killed or captured. The charge was a catastrophic failure. Lee, watching from the rear, said simply, "It is all my fault." He waited for a counterattack that never came. On July 4th, the same day Vicksburg fell, Lee's army retreated to Virginia. The tide had turned. The autumn of 1863 saw the battles continue, though the scale of Gettysburg had changed the landscape of the war. In November, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery on the site of the battle. His speech was brief, just 272 words in it. He reframed the war not just as a struggle for the Union, but as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. He spoke of a new birth of freedom, a promise that the dead had not died in vain. The Gettysburg Address became the spiritual compass of the war, a concise statement of the American experiment. As 1864 dawned, the war entered its final, grueling phase. Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant's strategy was simple but brutal: total war. He would apply pressure all along the line, preventing the Confederates from shifting troops to reinforce weak points. In the east, he would go after Lee. In the west, William Tecumseh Sherman would go after the Confederate Army in Georgia and the heartland of the South. It was a war of attrition, a grinding down of the South's ability to fight. Grant crossed the Rapidan River in May and entered the Wilderness, a dense tangle of scrub oak and pine where the battle was fought at close quarters and the woods caught fire, burning the wounded alive. It was a horrific start to a campaign known as the Overland Campaign. For 6 weeks, Grant and Lee were locked in a constant embrace of violence. Battles at Spotsylvania Courthouse, North Anna, and Cold Harbor followed. At Cold Harbor, Grant launched a futile assault that resulted in 7,000 Union casualties in 20 minutes. The newspapers in the North began to call him a butcher, but Grant did not retreat. He moved south, always south towards Petersburg, the rail hub that supplied Richmond. The fighting in the West under Sherman was equally relentless. Sherman, a man of complex character, believed that the war had to be taken to the Southern people. He fought his way to Atlanta, a major manufacturing and rail center. After a long siege, he captured the city in September. This victory was crucial for Lincoln's re-election. The Northern public was growing weary of the war, and the Democratic candidate, George McClellan, was running on a peace platform. Sherman's capture of Atlanta revitalized the Northern will to fight. In November, Sherman began his famous March to the Sea. He cut his telegraph lines and supply trains living off the land. His army cut a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction through Georgia, destroying railroads, crops, and infrastructure. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. He wanted to show the South that the Confederacy could not protect them. He captured Savannah in December, offering it to Lincoln as a Christmas present. The South was being hollowed out. The year 1865 began with the Confederacy on its knees. The economy was shattered, inflation was rampant, a loaf of bread cost hundreds of dollars. The soldiers were hungry, ragged, and deserting in droves. The dream of a slave-holding republic was collapsing. Grant had finally broken the stalemate at Petersburg on April Eck. After a long winter in the trenches, Grant launched an offensive that shattered Lee's lines. Lee telegraphed Jefferson Davis in Richmond that he must evacuate the government. That night, the Confederate capital fell. Union troops, many of them black soldiers, entered the city. The fires set by the fleeing Confederates to destroy military stores spread, consuming the city. It was a scene of apocalyptic destruction, the physical manifestation of the fall of the Confederacy. Lee's army, reduced to a starving remnant, fled west, hoping to link up with Johnston's army in North Carolina, but Grant was in pursuit. The Army of the Potomac, once the laughingstock of the war, was now a battle-hardened machine. They marched with a grim determination. On April 9th, Lee realized he was surrounded. Near a small village called Appomattox Courthouse, in the home of Wilmer McLean, a man who had moved there to escape the fighting that had started in his backyard at Bull Run, Robert E. Lee met Ulysses S. Grant. The contrast between the two men was striking. Lee was dressed in a pristine uniform, a towering figure of aristocratic dignity. Grant, who had arrived in a hurry, wore a muddy private's blouse with only his shoulder straps indicating his rank. They spoke briefly of their time together in the Mexican War. Then Grant wrote out the terms of surrender. They were generous, reflecting Lincoln's desire to heal the nation. The officers were allowed to keep their sidearms and horses. All other men were paroled, allowed to return to their homes so long as they pledged not to take up arms again. Grant even allowed the Confederate cavalrymen to keep their horses for the spring plowing. It was a moment of profound grace, a quiet ending to the thunderous violence. Lee returned to his men. After 4 years of arduous service, he told them, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. It was a painful admission. The men wept, embraced, and began the long walk home. The war was effectively over. But the tragedy was not yet finished. On April 14th, 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. It was a moment of relaxation, a brief respite from the burdens of command. During the performance, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, slipped into the president's box and shot him in the head. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house where he died the next morning. The nation, just beginning to celebrate peace, was plunged into deep mourning. The leader who had steered the ship of state through the storm was gone, taken by the very violence he had sought to end. It was the final casualty of the American Civil War. The aftermath of the conflict was a period of profound uncertainty. The South lay in ruins. The emancipation of 4 million enslaved people raised difficult questions about labor, land, and citizenship. The era of Reconstruction, a turbulent and often violent period, would follow. But for the men who fought, the war was a defining chapter of their lives. It was a time of supreme sacrifice, of courage and cowardice, of brother fighting brother. We look back now across the vast expanse of time at these sepia-toned figures, the faces staring out from the old photographs, grim, unsmiling, eyes weary beyond their years, tell a story of a generation tried by fire. They marched to the sounds of the guns, lived in the mud, and watched their friends die in the tall grass. They fought for a union, for a cause, for state rights, for human freedom, or simply because they were called to. The battlefields are quiet now. Gettysburg is a park, dotted with monuments of stone that stand like sentinels in the mist. Antietam's cornfields whisper in the wind. Vicksburg's bluffs overlook a peaceful river. The earth has healed, the scars covered by grass and trees, but the echoes remain. The Civil War was the crucible in which the modern United States was forged. It settled once and for all the question of whether this would be one nation or many. It ended the institution of chattel slavery, purging a sin from the land, though the struggle for equality would continue for a century more. It was a war of contradictions. It was fought with Napoleonic tactics and modern weapons, resulting in unprecedented slaughter. It was a war for democracy in which the president suspended habeas corpus. It was a war fought by volunteers, citizen soldiers who picked up rifles and learned to kill. They suffered the terrors of combat, the boredom of camp, and the ravages of disease. They wrote letters home, letters full of longing and love, letters that were sometimes stained with tears and mud. Consider the quiet moments in between the battles. The evenings around the campfire, the music of fife and drum, the harmonica playing a mournful tune from home. The soldiers traded coffee and tobacco across the picket lines, shouting insults one moment and joking the next, a strange camaraderie born of shared hardship. The hospital's grim warehouses of suffering, where the sawdust on the floor turned red with blood, and where Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield, moved tirelessly among the wounded. The prison camps, Andersonville and Elmira, where men wasted away in the heat and cold, dreaming of freedom. And consider the women who stayed behind, running the farms and businesses, holding families together in a world turned upside down. They formed aid societies, rolled bandages, and nursed the sick. They wrote letters to their husbands and sons, letters that kept hope alive. They buried their dead in silence, their grief a private tragedy and a public catastrophe. The Civil War is a story of people. It is the story of Abraham Lincoln, the tall, melancholy president who carried the weight of the nation on his shoulders. It is the story of Robert E. Lee, the general who chose his state over his country, leading his men with skill and honor to a bitter end. It is the story of Ulysses S. Grant, the quiet man from Illinois who understood that war meant fighting and fighting meant winning. It is the story of Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved man who became the voice of his people, arguing powerfully for the inclusion of black soldiers in the Union Army. It is also the story of the common soldier, the private from Ohio who had never traveled more than 10 miles from his farm until he marched to the sea, the farm boy from Alabama who fought for a cause he barely understood simply because his neighbors did, the Irish immigrant who fought to save the Union, hoping to find acceptance in his new land. These are the voices that make up the chorus of the war. Their diaries and letters are filled with simple, heartbreaking words. "I am tired of war," one wrote. "I want to go home," wrote another. "It is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight," grumbled a conscript. As the sun set on the 19th century, the veterans of the war, now gray-bearded and stooped, began to gather at reunions. They shook hands across the stone walls of Gettysburg. They shared stories and wept together. The animosity of the war years slowly gave way to a shared sense of American history. The blue and the gray merged into a single memory, but the cost was paid in blood. 620,000 men died in the American Civil War. That is a number almost too large to comprehend. It is more American deaths than in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. It was the bloodiest conflict in American history, a family quarrel that tore the house down. Every town and city in the North and South has its monument, a list of names carved in stone, a silent testament to the sacrifice. The war changed the landscape of the country. It spurred industrialization in the North, turning the United States into a global economic power. It solidified the power of the federal government, ending the era of states' rights supremacy. It redefined the relationship between the government and the citizen. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the fruits of the war, abolished slavery, established birthright citizenship, and guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. These were revolutionary changes, a second founding of the nation. Tonight, as we close our eyes and drift into sleep, let us travel back to those battlefields one last time. Imagine the mist rolling over the hills of Virginia in the early morning light. The sun is rising, burning off the fog, revealing the green fields and the quiet woods. The sound of the cannon is gone, replaced by the singing of birds. The camps are empty, the soldiers gone home. Only the monuments stand, silent and still. In the quiet of the night, we can hear the whispers of history, the stories of bravery and fear, of loss and redemption. The Civil War is not just a chapter in a history book, it is the bedrock of the modern world. It was a time when the United States faced its greatest challenge and survived, though it was scarred forever. So let the images of the past float through your mind. The gentle rolling of the rivers, the rustle of the leaves in the forest, the quiet dignity of the men who fought. Feel the weight of history settling around you, a heavy, warm blanket. The war is over, the peace has been won, the soldiers can finally rest, and so can you.